History of the cell theory has been a complicated process ever since Zacharias and Hans Janssen invented the first compound microscope in 1590. But to quickly summarize it, Anton Leeuwenhoek was a scientist who used his own microscope to study small stuff. He discovered germs and bacteria and reported his findings to a colleague in England. That colleague then discovered cells while looking at a small piece of cork using his microscope. Well, at least he first discovered cork cells. This colleague is now known as Robert Hooke, but in some complicated way, Hooke became enemies with Sir Isaac Newton and they started to fight. Even though they were rivals, they still exchanged ideas back and forth. However, after Hooke died, a lot of his research and discoveries disappeared, with a little blame on Newton. Yet Hooke's discoveries were soon rediscovered when we refound his work. Hooke was not the only person who studied cells, but he was supposedly the first one, so technically he is more important. From time to time, the cell theory developed from a list of observations that look like bleh to a scientific study of small organisms that build up on living things. There are 3 parts to this cell theory. 1. All living things are made up of one or more cells. In other words, if you are not made up of cells, you are not living. 2. The cell is the smallest living thing that can perform all functions of life. There are no smaller living things that are smaller than a cell. Which is weird because in order for an organism to be considered living, it needs a cell. So you can't have a living thing smaller than a cell that is made up of cells. Unless, of course, the cells are much smaller, but it is still a cell. 3. All cells must come from pre-existing cells. It's really that simple. Cells are made by dividing an original cell in half. So why do we need to know these useless facts? You really don't need to know this, but in order to understand life, you do. So what are cells? Well, according to the dictionary, a cell is the smallest structural and functional unit of an organism. There are many different kinds of cells. Not really. One is a prokaryotic cell and the other is a eukaryotic cell. This is a prokaryotic cell. Look at it deeply. This is a eukaryotic cell. Let me give you 5 minutes. Just kidding, but notice the difference. As you can tell, prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells are very different. But talking about different cells is not the goal here. We are here to talk about the everyday use of the cell theory. Not really. Not everyone uses the cell theory every day. Maybe scientists do, but I bet not everyone does. I do realize that our cells are functioning all the time, 24/7. Sometimes even when we're dead. We may not use the cell theory every day, but our cells are being used every day, and without cells, we will not be functioning properly. So in conclusion, Robert Hooke was famous for being the scientist whom Newton hates, and being the scientist who discovered cells simply by looking at slices of cork from an old and antique microscope. This then led to the discovery that all living things are made up of one or more cells, hence starting the 3 parts of the cell theory. The other 2 are that no other living thing is smaller than a cell, and that cells are made up of cells which are made up of cells made up of cells. Cells are things students in cytology, the study of cells, studies. But unless you are a cytologist, you have no need of the cell theory in your everyday life.
Created using Powtoon.